Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our eighth and final module, STEM and Social Justice. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Terrell Morden, who is an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is a proud scholar activist. Dr. Morden's work centers on transforming how Blackness is positioned in STEM, advocating for justice and joy for Black women, students, and other marginalized groups. He holds degrees in chemistry, neuroscience, and education, and is committed to walking it like he talks it in all he does. And with that, I'll pass it on to him. Get started.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you all are having an amazing Friday. I know I get the pleasure of sort of closing out the modules, and I will ensure that we have great, rich, robust conversations, and that we have the opportunity to really think even more deeply about how we are engaging STEM from a social justice perspective, but even more specifically, not just from a social justice perspective, but from a liberatory perspective. And I will share this too, although it's not quite yet fully public, so please don't tweet it or anything. But I just got promoted last week, so now I'm an associate professor with tenure. So I'm excited about that, but I have to wait a couple more weeks before I can be public about that. So thank you so much. All right, well, let's go ahead and dive in. Give me a chance to just pull my slides up. So, title of my presentation for this module is Black Liberatory Approaches to STEM Education. And throughout this session, these are sort of our 4 key learning objectives. By the end of the session, I hope that you all will have the ability to define Black liberation within the context of STEM education. You'll have a better understanding of why it is important to take a Black liberatory approach, particularly within our current sociopolitical context. We'll then think deeply about how we can actually use Black liberatory conceptual frameworks to guide our decision-making processes as we are organizing our lessons, as we are organizing our syllabi, or even organizing our classroom management practices, something that we don't always think about in higher education, despite the fact that it's still very much prevalent in the way that we teach and engage our learners. And then we will end with opportunities for you all to actually use some of these Black liberatory frameworks to think intentionally about how to transform your teaching, how to transform your classroom management practices. If you happen to be running or monitoring any broadening participation programs, you can also think about what it means to use this conceptual framework within that work. Or if you happen to hold any administrative positions or power, how we can begin to think deeply about our institutional, our college, our departmental level policies and practices, and how these function as gatekeepers for access, for success, for engagement. So before we get started, as all good professors do, let's see how you all did with your homework. So I want everyone to take a quick moment to reflect on the 3 readings that we shared. I think it was 3, it might have been 2. The readings that I had shared, and I would like, you can either say it out loud or if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, to respond to one of the following questions. From the reading, all we want to do is be free. What are some examples of how anti-Blackness shows up in STEM education that stood out to you and why? Or from the reading Re-envisioning the Culture, of the recommendations provided by the authors, which recommendation stood out to you the most and why? So you can pick one of those 2 questions based off of the readings. And then everyone, I would like to hear a wondering that you still have, kind of based off of the readings, getting into this module around social justice. Is there a thought, a question, something burning in your mind and your spirit that you really want to think a little bit more deeply about or hope to have answered in this module? So you can pick one of the questions and then share your wonderings. I'll give you all about 45 seconds to think And then I will engage a little pedagogical practice of calling some people in. Oh, wait, here we go. Noting that Black students are underrepresented in STEM fields. Okay. And Michael, is this your response to the first question or the second question? First, got it. All right. And what about a wondering that you still have? Zach, I was surprised at the extent to which educators suppress Black joy in the classrooms. All right, Zach, thank you so much. Do you have a wondering that you still have from the readings?
I guess one wondering that I keep going back and forth with is the extent to which I should be teaching the history of science. There are like excellent contributions I could add and include from Black scientists or scientists from other underrepresented groups, but I think over the past few weeks I've been debating whether or not it's worth even teaching the history of like major scientists who've made major contributions to the field. Is that an important component of my class? And so that's something that after these readings, I'm continuing to wonder.
No, I appreciate that. And I think there's a lot of tension that we hear in this. How much content should we keep in our classes? What content is actually necessary and relevant for students to be able to move forward in their scientific knowledge and learning and understanding? And what content can we actually kind of start to do away with and replace with new content as we think about what it is to actually know and be able to innovate within our scientific domains? I appreciate that. Let's see. How about Carrie? I'd like to call you into the conversation. Any responses or wonderings?
Yeah, I was that story in the little sort of anecdote at the beginning of All We Want to Do Is Be Free, where they describe these children being chastised just for being excited. It was really heartbreaking. And I guess one thing that I wonder about is there aren't very many Black students, in my classrooms. And so I do wonder what kind of classroom and environment I'm creating. And I don't know that I get to practice, that anti-racism enough. Yeah.
I appreciate that. How do we attend to the demographics of our classroom, paying attention to who is overrepresented, who is represented, and then who is underrepresented? And when I say overrepresented and under, I'm more specifically thinking about how our classrooms reflect our general population. And so if everyone was represented at parity, then we would see how, within our specific domains, our classrooms should reflect percentage-wise the greater population. Thomas, I see you had here, everyone brings something special to STEM, particularly Black students, which can help bring new and rich ideas to current problems. Thank you so much. How about, is it Ji Chun? Did I say that correctly?
Yes. Oh, okay. Just a second. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I'm like a math professor. I always wondering. I think as someone just mentioned that. So because I served as graduate coordinator in the department, I even reached out to some professor at I think Mid Tennessee University, because one time I was in a conference, I met a Black graduate student. I said, yeah, you did pretty good job, right? So they asked him, yeah, can you recommend some friends to our program? Because we are always been looking for like black students. But for various reasons, we never got the success, you know. But then in recent years, we got hired like one black professor. But he's not in US. He originally from Nigeria. Then he brought in some like student from Nigeria. And also they stay in their own group. Like I talked to him, yeah, can you recommend some student to me? But they just stay in their community. So for various reasons, you know. So I don't know. I think my perspective is students, black students also need to come out. You know, so I think to reach out to other community also, not just stay in their own comfortable zone. That's my feeling. You know, when I reach out to like Tennessee, finally that department chair, now he become dean. I forgot the Middle Tennessee or which one. I have to dig out my email, you know. So he recommended some student to our place. Then I offered them the full support, but finally get a better position. They moved elsewhere. So I mean, it's kind of challenging. We've been working hard trying to do this, you know. So, but I think we need some people to recommend them, and also they stayed out their community. So that's my feeling too.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And kind of what I'm hearing is, as educators, as researchers, as scholars, how are we actually creating the conditions by which our learning environments, our working environments are conducive to support people? If people are wanting to remain outside of our spaces, are there certain things that are keeping them out or wanting them to remain outside, as opposed to things that are actually inviting them to come and participate and be engaged? I see, Michael, I see your other comment. Need to encourage Black scientists to inspire the next generation as role models to make it cool to study STEM. Thank you. Is it Hannes or Haynes?
It's Hannes.
Hannes.
Yeah, it's a foreign name, so no worries. With the reading, I was a little surprised when I read that like research is more discredited even just because it's from a Black scholar. So I was, I think that got me thinking also, like how deep rooted we sometimes have prejudices, or that it even goes that far. And with wondering, I was also mainly thinking about my classroom. So what can I change in my classroom? And it's a little bit also underlined with what Carrie already mentioned. I mean, we maybe have sometimes one Black student in the classroom, so it's very few students. So how do we make them feel as part of everyone else, right? So that's
I appreciate that. How about Donald?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for calling on me. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot over the years. And, you know, in science, we like to think of things as being objective and straightforward, and there's no biases, or at least that's our goal in our scientific procedures and our scientific classrooms. But that's not the way people are. Right, society outside of our classroom and in the culture, there clearly is structural racism that I've learned over the years surprised me. Right, growing up in a largely white community, when you move out of that into Texas and then Hawaii, it hit me in the face. That it isn't a neutral world out there, and the students that come into your classroom are not. They don't have the same background history of being encouraged to go into science, for example. They may not have the role models that, of course, being a white male, I never thought about it growing up. Of course, everybody has a role model. I have a role model, right? And then you realize, no, that's not true. And so then how does that affect how you should teach your classes to, you know, certainly minimally welcome everybody into your classroom? But what more can you do to, you know, really encourage people from different backgrounds, Black, Hispanic, etc., you know, that yes, you can succeed in science. So I've worked on this for many years, and I'm glad to have this discussion this morning.
Thank you. And then last but certainly not least, is it Jing Chun?
Yes. Yeah, I think just like other people said, we need to encourage the Black students or scientists to join the STEM team. Like I have students in Black, they are working in my lab doing research. I think I always encourage them to do what they like to do. They are doing very well. They're trying to be doctor. So I think it's somehow you need to encourage them. They probably can be more successful than without those resources. That's my thinking.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate all of you all. I did see, I believe it's Adele that you joined. I won't call you in just this time, unless you have a reflection that you would like to share. But I am grateful that you all are helping or starting to think a little bit more deeply about how are we supporting, engaging, empowering our Black students in our STEM spaces. So we will continue to build into this train of thought as we get into this idea of thinking specifically about a Black liberatory framework and its application to STEM. But before we get into even thinking about what Black liberatory frameworks are, I think it is important for us to first start our conversations with ideas that we might be a little bit more familiar with, such as inclusivity, equity, or even justice. And so you may or may not have seen this particular schematic or a version of this schematic around as people try to talk about what does it mean to define these ideas of equality or equity or social justice. I like this particular version because it includes, the artist includes this idea of reality, noting the gross disparities between people when it comes to resources and their abilities to engage with one another. But one of the things that I also like to point out within this schematic is particularly how we are thinking about this concept of social justice. And so everyone doesn't have to respond, but if someone would like to, based off of what you see here, how do you think we as a society define this idea of social justice? If you're comparing one frame to the other, what makes the justice frame different? Equal opportunities for all. Anyone else?
Removing barriers for everyone.
Removing barriers for everyone. And so, in fact, when we think about these definitions, we see equity as being this process by which resources and opportunities are provided to groups who are marginalized or othered as a mean to account for the systemic and structural barriers. So going back, we see equity, we see a difference in the resource allocation of boxes so that all three of these participants are able to look over this fence into the actual game. And then we see justice, this process by which barriers to access, engagement, participation are removed or mitigated to ensure that everyone has a fair chance. So going back, the gate is no longer there. So there is no concern about this allocation of boxes or resources because the obstruction that was preventing these three individuals from engaging with this game is no longer present. Now, what's interesting to think about, though, when we even look at this idea of justice as removing barriers, we can begin to ask even more critical questions about how do we get to this idea of justice. And so while we've removed this fence and these three individuals can watch this baseball game, what is a slightly more deeper, more critical question that we might ask even as we look at this social justice panel? Any sports fans on the call? Anybody ever been to a baseball game? No? No baseball game attendees? Go Cubs. Hey, yes. Wrigley Field. Where's the best seat of the house at Wrigley? Or where would one presume the best seat of the house would be? A bench seat inside the actual stadium. So here, we're seeing this action of justice happen by removing this fence so that these three individuals can watch the game, when a more critical, more nuanced question could be, was the removal of the fence the actual action of justice that needed to occur? Could these three individuals not have the same opportunity to sit in the seats and watch the game? Or if they're standing on the field, maybe they actually want to play the game. So did we inquire with them specifically to determine what would actually be the act of justice that was needed to ensure that barriers were removed and that fairness was actually provided? So when we're thinking about liberation, liberation takes us that one step further from this concept of justice or even equity, to think about a freeing of one's mind, body, spirit, how we understand knowledge, truth, and reality, because of the fact that we have these political, economic, psychological, and cultural forces that all shape and inform our existence as individuals. People who talk a lot about epistemological injustices or epistemic violence speak specifically about how the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonization attempted to create this universal way of knowing across the entire world. And prior to settler colonialism, you had different funds of knowledge that were represented in these different countries and landscapes of how people made sense of the natural world and how people would innovate within the natural world. But as a result of settler colonialism, we now have this space where, in order for someone to actually quote unquote innovate or explore or understand, they have to fit a certain mold, they have to practice a certain ritual, and they have to participate in certain spaces and conversations to be deemed as this person who is now innovating and exploring and understanding within the natural world. So we've created this epistemic injustice when it came to our ability to actually explore, explain, or even predict how we do certain things. And as a result of that injustice, we now have these versions of reality, ontology, that are now constraining how folks can exist and operate, that show up in spiritual and physical and structural means. So liberation looks beyond just the policies and the practices and the barriers to ask questions about the mind, the body, and the spirit. Where if we're talking specifically about Black liberation, then we're thinking about how anti-Black oppression shows up through our policies, through our practices, through our cultural norms, through our cultural values, through our cultural beliefs, and how all of these attempt to shape how a person is supposed to quote unquote show up and exist as they're trying to navigate within this space. And I specifically look at some of the work of Joyce King coming out of Emory University, who talks about this Black liberatory praxis, who says that in order to engage in this perspective or mindset, that there has to be this restoration of this indigenous African historical and cultural consciousness and contributions. So, what do we actually know about African and African diasporic people pre-colonization? How do we understand their ways of knowing, doing, and being? How do we understand the scientific innovations, the mathematical contributions that they were doing in these pre-colonial times? And to what extent then is this brought within our classroom spaces as opposed to left only in our history courses or in our sociology or anthropology courses? Joyce King then talks about how, through this Black liberatory perspective, we can begin to facilitate this self-reliance. And self-reliance isn't this individual bootstrap, pull myself up by my own accord, but is recognizing what they say in this West African proverb of Ubuntu, I am because you are. And so it's this collectivist, communal kind of mindset that says that by virtue of us being together in community, I am no more different or separate from you. And so we should be working together as a collective unit as we're moving towards this self-actualization, activism, and agency. And then King inspires us to think intentionally about theory, about methodology, and about pedagogy, and how we build these different ideas from the lived experiences of the people with the people. And so, as opposed to doing our research and our experiments outside of communities in the ivory towers, leaving it only for the academics to see and to understand, King says that this Black liberatory perspective, again, realizes that the researcher, the scholar, the educator cannot be separate from the people that they are working with. And so, as they're thinking about their pedagogy, as they're thinking about their teaching practices, they have to be intentional to be in community with, to dialogue with, to theorize with said individuals. And so it's from that perspective, too, as we think about sort of these social, structural, political ways that Black liberation functions, that we can then point to some philosophical approaches to liberation. And Bobby Harrell here then talks about this internal cycle. What is the individual process by which somebody may make liberatory-based decisions? And so as you see here in this cycle that she explains, that there's this level of self-empowerment, there's this level of help seeking, there's this level of community building, there's this level of coalescing, creating change, maintaining change, and preparation that reflects how one engages internally in this liberatory praxis. Now, interestingly enough, Bobby Harrell's perspective on liberation isn't only for these broader social, political, structural forces and changes that we see specifically in Joyce King's definition, but Bobby Harrell's approach even talks about how within ourselves, there might be certain behaviors and practices that we've been socialized into by virtue of where we grew up, by virtue of our home environments, by virtue of our communities, that we may choose to break free from. You may hear a lot of people talk about this idea of generational curses or not wanting to pass along generational traumas. So Bobby Harrell's internal cycle talks about how people think intentionally about breaking some of those generational traumas or generational curses as they're looking to be more liberated in their own individual decision-making and space. So coming out of it, we can kind of have these two sort of approaches to thinking about Black liberatory perspectives. We have this individual internal work where across both Joyce King and Bobby Harrell, we can see this idea of a Black socio-political consciousness. So how do we have this critical awareness of the social and material conditions? How do we develop a deep, nuanced understanding to how an individual shows up in relationship to community or in relationship to certain spaces and structures? And then how do we attend to the will and the determination of the person to actually make change for themselves? And this will and determination isn't just abstract, but is deeply connected to this commitment to dismantling these systems and structures that attempt to oppress individuals. And I add these stars of the motivation for the commitment can vary because you can see somebody as a co conspirator, someone who is joining someone else's struggle, being motivated and committed to dismantling systems and structures because of their own sense of moral consciousness. Or you could actually see somebody having stake in the game. They may have children, grandchildren, cousins, nieces, nephews who are impacted by these spaces. And so, because of their love and support for those others, they are deeply committed to engaging in these spaces. Or they themselves might be experiencing these forms of oppression. And so, they are deeply committed to transforming the systems and the structures so that they can exist in a society where they are freer. So, all of that's internal to the individual. Then we also see, on the other hand, the collective, more external action. So, what does it mean to actually show up as someone operating with this kind of mindset? And so, the first kind of key point is this servant leadership, how someone invests their time, their resources, and their talents to actually work towards change. And in the process of doing so, it is this unearthing and this cultivation of Black stories, Black perspectives, and Black needs. So going back to something that Zach had brought up in terms of the history of science, how we're being intentional in this liberatory perspective to engage in the history and philosophy of science from this global consciousness perspective, and not just from this Western Eurocentric perspective, where everyone can know something about Charles Darwin, but maybe not necessarily know something about Charles Drew, despite the fact that they may be familiar with blood centers and donations and things of that nature. And then there's this enacting change that attempts to transform the system while also healing the people. And so the actions are focused on policies, they're focused on practices, they're focused on norms, but they also recognize that in the process of making these grand scheme changes, we also have to attend to the person's everyday experiences. And so these traumas might be deeply rooted. And so there may be some healing work that has to happen along the way in order for them to see themselves as reflected within these changes, or even for them to value or appreciate the changes that are being brought forward. An example that I can think of that's not specific to Black liberation, but I think about how there was a lot of research around flipped classrooms and how there was a lot of excitement about doing this flipped classroom model. And then if you were to interview students, they would tell you that they probably despised the flipped classroom model. But then we had to ask deeper questions as to why did they despise that? Well, if we look within these lands that we currently call the United States, from kindergarten to 12th grade, they were socialized to thinking that learning happens in the classroom and that the best way that they can demonstrate their learning is by taking a test. And so if you go 18 years of being socialized in this particular manner, and then now you put them in a classroom space where the model is flipped, there's a lot of internal work that they would have to work through and process, given the fact that so much of their lived experience was deeply rooted in a prior perspective. So that's what I mean by engaging change while working to heal the people. There may be things that are liberatory that free all of us, that may be uncomfortable, that may bring about a certain level of fear and anxiety because the change is so different. But that healing work helps account for that uncomfortableness and that shift in perspective as we're getting to a more freer, more healthier, more wholer society. So I'll pause right there, because that's just kind of setting the framework of what is a Black liberatory approach before we get into the need of a Black liberatory approach. And we'll just see if there are any questions, any comments, or any thoughts that come to mind. All right, so this section I'm going to kind of go through relatively faster because some of this you've already been exposed to by the prior readings, but I wanted to make sure that it was brought back to our attention as we're thinking intentionally about our approach to actually engaging Black liberatory thoughts in 2025. And as you can see, my cover slide accounts for two very recent press releases and announcements. The Justice Department establishing the Civil Rights Fraud Initiative, and seeing then how said Justice Department is enacting the Civil Rights Fraud Initiative as they are going in and probing into university spaces. So you might have seen some of this data in one of the research articles, but from the National Center of Educational Statistics, the data that we have most recently shows how our four-year science and engineering degrees that are coming out of four-year universities have been awarded to U.S. citizens as disaggregated by race. And so from 2000 to 2019, you can see this trend of bachelor's degrees being awarded to U.S. citizens. Given our focus on Black students in this space, we see right here in this blue line that for about 20 years, roughly 8.5% to 9% of our degrees in science and engineering are being awarded to Black students. The data itself shows underrepresentation because going back to this idea of population parity, Black folks make up about 13.5% to 14% of the United States. Now, you may say that this data is a little older and we might want to look a little bit more deeper. Can't see the slide. Is it not showing?
I can see it.
Oh, okay. You might say that that data is a little older. Well, if we look now at the more recent data, from 2021, we see the disaggregation of four-year science and engineering degrees disaggregated by race. And if I look specifically among Black students, and I look at the four-year bachelor's degree here, you see is still roughly about 9%, despite the population being about 14.3%. So we're still seeing underrepresentation in our four-year science and engineering degrees as disaggregated by race for Black students. That data itself is troubling, but if we compare that data to data that we have that talk about students' interest in majoring in STEM, our best approximate variable for understanding students entering into our four-year universities, we see that about 23% of our Black students express intention in majoring in STEM for this data point collected at fall 2013. So roughly students who then would be graduating in 19, 20, and 21. Yet, despite the fact that we had 23% intending to major in STEM, we're still seeing this consistent 9% graduation rate. And this is happening as a result to what I've been able to understand from Black student STEM experiences. And you will see across institutional types, be it HBCUs, minority serving institutions, predominantly white institutions, or Hispanic serving institutions, be it physics, chemistry, biology, electrical and computer engineering, or even health sciences, Black students express their experiences with their STEM classrooms and research spaces where they feel targeted, they experience hostility, and even these larger stereotypes that attempt to govern how it is that they show up. So this one participant says that Black students, STEM is dominated by males. This other student says that STEM is pushed more on white people and Asians because they're stereotyped as smart. This student says that there's only but so many of them in their class that they feel like they have to represent their whole race in their courses. And so they're afraid to speak out. They're afraid to ask questions because they don't want to say anything wrong, because they assume that if they say something wrong, they'll be stereotyped as dumb because they're Black. This particular student had a professor in engineering that gave out applications to fast food restaurants, telling students that they had jobs for them because clearly they didn't want to be in engineering based off of their performance. Or you even see in the health sciences that students feel like they have to put a lot of energy in surviving their STEM spaces, not necessarily thriving, not necessarily being successful, but just being able to survive. And they believe that they have to take heat and that they have to be in this advocacy space because of how the culture of STEM is set up. And again, this is data collected from all across the nation. So East Coast, Southwest, and the Midwest, and even the Pacific Northwest, about how Black students are talking about their STEM experiences. And this is happening despite the fact that we've been engaged in these broadening participation endeavors since about 1950, where we had these targeted opportunities, these community building, these skill development, and even this offering of financial support. So by engaging in sort of this Black liberatory thinking, looking at the data in terms of numerically student representation, ontologically how students are describing their experiences, and comparing it to the opportunities that we provide, I ask myself, how is it that Black students continue to experience these things? And it goes back to how we as educators, faculty, researchers talk about Black students and their experiences in STEM. And we use words such as Black students as being at risk. We say that they're underrepresented. We say that they are under-resourced. We say that they are underprepared. We say that they are a minority, so pathologically a minority, and not numerically in the minority. And then for those that are able to be successful, we hone in on their resilience, their ability to overcome these structural barriers, which if we think a little bit more deeply about what all of these scripts are ultimately suggesting, is this mindset that we've adopted that Black students, Black folks are functionally broken in STEM, and that the only way that they can be successful in STEM is if they are fixed. To call someone at risk, to call someone underrepresented, to call someone under-resourced, to call someone underprepared, to call someone a minority, or to only focus then on the effort and the energy that they put into their spaces to survive, as the student shared, hones in on this deficit-based ideology around their capabilities, their ideas, their ability to innovate, or even their reasons for why they're exploring these STEM spaces. And so this deficit ideology shows up in what I consider to be this Cinderella type mentality, where we, as fairy godmothers, attempt to sprinkle our targeted opportunities on these quote unquote underrepresented, at risk, under-resourced Black students in order to then transform them to actually go to the ball, or to function as a scientist, or to be a mathematician, or to be someone that can exist within a community that has these rules, these norms, these values, these beliefs, and these practices that again perpetuate this continuous deficit-based ideology. And all of that is deeply connected to the social, political, and historical culture of science, where our ideologies that we teach in our university spaces trace back to scientific racism, traces back to Thomas Jefferson's belief that Blacks were innately inferior, thinking about how phrenology came about as a pseudoscience to actually prove, quote unquote, racial stratification that was then adapted by social Darwinism. If we think about some of the methodological practices that we use today, J. Marion Sims, who's being hallmarked as the quote unquote father of gynecology, tormented many enslaved women to protect his technique. If we think about where evolutionary biology or genetics or even Pearson's correlation comes from, we see their connections to the eugenics movement. If we can think about epidemiology in relationship to Tuskegee, cancer biology, and ethics in scientific research as connected to Henrietta Lacks, or even in our more contemporary spaces and our biotechnologies. We saw during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that by normalizing light sensing technologies, such as pulse oximeters on white skin, these technologies could not functionally read the oxygen intake and outtake of Black patients because of the melanin in their skin and was constantly leading to misdiagnoses. So our methodologies and our ideologies create then these praxis of objectivity, individualism, and competition. And in this here, it's highlighted because it takes you to a link that you can go to that shows historically and chronologically how different decisions and actions from the 1400s to present continue to show up to create this quote unquote Western Eurocentric perspective of STEM that we teach as objective, individual, and competitive in our classroom spaces. And so what ends up happening is that those ideologies as our fundamental roots then show up in our K-12 spaces and in our post-secondary spaces that then lead to the experiences that Black students perceive and experience within their classroom spaces. So in order for us to understand what Black folks are responding to, we have to again have this deeper look into the epistemologies, the ontologies, the axiologies, what we consider to be ethical, and our methodologies, our practices that show up within these STEM spaces. And that was all prior to 2020. And we can think about how much of the world has changed as a result of 2020. And I'm really going to speed through this because there's a lot, but I just want you to kind of localize where we are now as a society, recognizing that all of this that I had just previously shared were things that were existing and operating prior to 2020. 2020, we get the height of the COVID pandemic. We have this quote unquote racial awakening that's followed by these outward displays of investments in Black lives. That is then followed by an insurrection and an attempt to actually quote unquote take back the country. This then leads to the banning of books, to knowledge and to understanding specifically connected to Black histories and Black stories across the nation. We see the attempts at the intersections of both race, gender, and sexuality, and how then we get to 2023 and this overturning of affirmative action in college admissions. But wait, what's most interesting is that despite the fact that it was only for college admissions, it then shows up in all of our policies inside and outside of university spaces. We see challenges happening around immigration, challenges happening more broadly in this Black diaspora as we think about experiences that people are happening and how it's showing up on our college campuses as college students were taking to the streets in 2023 and 2024 to protest injustices that were happening across the world. We then get into the challenging of scientific knowledge more broadly and this idea of whether or not people actually trust science when it comes to understanding things like climate change. Declining enrollments, we get to 2025, and then we have executive order after executive order after executive order after executive order that continues to come in to constrain the teaching, the experiencing, and the understanding of certain people's way of life within our country, even more specifically within our schooling spaces. This leads to then cuts, which then leads to freezes, which then leads to restrictions of access and admission. And now there's a hit list. I happen to be on that hit list. We think then, as the White House shows, that we have a king coming straight from the White House's social media, a screenshot that I took myself. And then the challenges to our economy that were supposed to be addressed that are not yet addressed. This is still in January and February, mind you. We get to the summertime and we see that there's actual legal authority to continue dismantling the Department of Education, followed by now this establishment of the Justice Department that I shared with you all about, where they're attempting to take back resources, opportunities, insight, information, knowledge, and experiences that quote unquote promote reverse discrimination. So let's take a moment to pause. Having reviewed Black STEM experiences and having thought about what I just shared in the more contemporary, how does this information make you feel? What does knowing this information make you want to do? And then how can you use this information within your own practice to be part of change-making endeavors? And these aren't necessarily things that you need to share out loud. You don't necessarily have to write them in the chat if you don't want to. But again, going back to this Black liberatory perspective as internal work, I want you to actually take some time to internally process how all of this information is connecting or potentially disconnecting with you. So we'll take about 2 minutes and have some time to personally reflect. And I encourage you to actually write your reflections down. All right. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to kind of process some things, because we will just take a quick bio break. So maybe 5 minutes. If you need to stretch, use the restroom, get you some water, and then we will come back. All right, we will slowly make our ways back as we get into now thinking about these conceptual frameworks, more specifically the Black liberatory conceptual frameworks. Let me do this right quick, because chances are not going to get a chance to do all of the things. I tend to over-prepare. So what is a theory versus a conceptual framework? If we think about theory from an educational stance is a tool that organizes our thinking regarding what is important, what is superficial, when we're designing, investigating, interpreting, and understanding work. Theories then provide those underlying assumptions, those norms and rules. They guide the research process, and they ultimately can help us explore, explain, predict outcomes. Now, I recognize that our approach to theory is different than how you may say discussing theory within the science spaces, but it really helps to think about theory as like these guidelines, these boundaries, and this foundation for helping to understand what's taking place within a particular context. And then a conceptual framework like theory is very similar in providing those structures. However, they're different than theory in a sense that conceptual frameworks allow you to pull from different pieces and kind of blend them together to create something new. So theory are pretty rigid in how they've been both developed and how they're used. Conceptual framework are a little bit more looser in terms of their application within the actual space. And so we're going to think intentionally about a couple of conceptual frameworks that we can use to help you all in supporting a redesign of the lessons that you brought. So you already introduced to the Black liberatory K-12 science education conceptual framework, where the guiding principles were starting with Black students are brilliant, disrupting existing anti-Black biases, valuing Black student contributions, reinserting Black perspectives and histories, embracing Black engagement, centering Black girl magic and Black boy joy, and acknowledging the diversity of Blackness. This is going to be the framework that we're going to work with more specifically in just a moment. But I also want to share with you all other frameworks that you may want to consider as you're continuing in your scholarly and pedagogical development in this space. So just like there's a Black liberatory science education framework, Dr. Nicholas Ortiz has proposed a Black liberatory mathematics education framework, where the core components of this particular framework looks at beauty, plenty, rest, exclusivity, and eternity, and how we use these concepts to then redesign the actual teaching and learning of mathematics in ways that promote beauty, plenty, rest, exclusivity, and eternity. I will make sure that you all have access to that reading as you see the QR code and the link, so that if you want to engage with this framework, you can think about how it can support you in the adaptation of mathematics spaces. We also have abolitionist teaching. So abolitionist teaching as a framework has these three kind of core components: agitation, activism, and advocacy. And so abolitionist teaching, as you can see through the research of Vanessa Lewis and Natalie King, can become a conceptual framework to organize the teaching and the learning processes of our actual science and STEM spaces. How do we incorporate this idea of agitation within our learning? How do we incorporate this idea of activism within our learning? How do we incorporate this idea of advocacy? Where the abolitionist teaching model comes out of the book that Bettina Love wrote back in 2019, We Want to Do More Than Survive. Again, access to these papers if you want to read this framework more and how they engage them within the teaching and the learning space. And then for those who might be in engineering or even computer science, James Holly Jr. and Lauren Toms Quigley talk about this reparatory justice model and how we can use these premises of a reparatory justice model to rethink the teaching, the learning, and the design of engineering education. Also, we'll have access to this paper as well. And then my favorite, well, not my favorite, but what I'm most excited about is you're now starting to see people talk about joy and how can we think intentionally about devising classroom spaces, lessons, classroom management spaces from this perspective of joy. And so you have Jennifer Adams here, who provides this heuristic for manifesting Black joy within science learning spaces by attending to Black excellence, Black kinship, Black aesthetics, and Black inventiveness. As well, you're starting to see people engage with Afrofuturism or African futurism. So if you all are familiar with the Marvel movie Black Panther, or if you all watched the HBO show Lovecraft Country, or if you read any of Octavia Butler's work, Parable of the Sower, or if you've read any of Nakia Okafor's Binti, people think about this concept of Afrofuturism as being this conceptual framework to redesign how we can teach STEM, computer science, engineering within these spaces. And I'll actually give you an example of work that I'm currently doing right now to use Afrofuturism in the design, as we think intentionally about redesigning STEM spaces. So going back to this Black liberatory perspective of internal and collective, internal work, how are we thinking about our own sociopolitical consciousness, how are we thinking about our commitments, external work, how do we show set commitments through leadership, through our process of discovery and incorporation, and by working on transforming policies and structures while also supporting people. Here is work that I've been doing in the biology space through this project, the Re-envisioning Culture Network, where instead of having these Western Eurocentric roots as how we're building our biology lessons, we build from Blackness to then create these new content to then transform the lived experiences and outcomes within these spaces. And so we have done so using Afrofuturism, where, as you see here on the screen, the principles of Afrofuturism promote this understanding of multiple truths of the past to ensure a promising future. It has this unapologetic centering of Blackness by focusing on Black creativity, Black capabilities, and Black possibilities. And it engages in science and STEAM innovation and speculative fiction to consider this futuristic sort of world-making opportunities. So core ideas that show up in Afrofuturism are identity, otherness, time, science fiction and utopian realities, and liberation. And so what we did is we took these principles and we began to ask ourselves, if we're teaching a class in biology, How could we incorporate these ideas within the content, within the problems, within the solutions, within the activities, and within the assessments? And how can we begin to match stories of Black scientists historically and contemporarily within that space? And this is what it turned out, or one of the lessons that turned out, this Afrofuturistic approach to studying mitosis and thinking about cell division and reproduction as it's connected to melanin, recognizing that melanin as a biological function helps produce the skin tones that we see, but sociopolitically, it can also connect to colorism and racialization and these understandings of beauty standards. So how then can we also think about Black women scientists such as Jewel Plummer Cobb, who did research on melanocytes and skin damage and the overexposure to UV light radiation? How do we also think about mitosis with the story of Henrietta Lacks and the use of her HeLa cells that are happening because of their ability to rapidly produce and divide that made them so commodifiable? How does that get brought into this lesson, as well as upcoming scientists who are also studying things like skin cancer, where we're incorporating all of these things together to learn about the phases of the cell cycle, where we can then assess them both on the history and give them the opportunity to think about in the future as we continue to have overexposure to UV light radiation. How can we begin to devise projects that account for mitosis, cancer, cell division, reproduction? So this is one lesson that we put together. We have like this whole backwards design model. We have the activities, the flashcards, the histories, and the idea is that we're going to continue to build out an entire introductory undergraduate biology course where people could either teach the course as is or take the lessons as they are developed and incorporate them in their learning space. So now, for the remainder time that we have together, I want us to engage in some of the processes that I showed you just a moment ago and some of the processes that you've been exposed to overall. So I'm going to put a link into the chat that's going to take you to this Google document that you can copy and paste. And in that document, it maps out the principles of the Black Liberatory K-12 science education model. And in mapping out those principles, I want you all to use some of the resources in the article, as well as resources that I provide in addition, to identify how you might be able to incorporate one or multiple of those components within an existing lesson that you teach. So for example, Principle 4, Reinserting Black Perspectives and Histories, can you identify a historical and a contemporary Black scientist whose research and work connects to a lesson similar to Jewel Plummer Cobb and mitosis that can then be incorporated within the lesson on mitosis to show connections between Black contributions to STEM and Black possibilities in STEM? And then if we have time, I have provided a backwards design template for you to then say, all right, now how do I take said lesson and then rework the lesson in a way where I can ensure that all of these principles are meaningfully showing up within the classroom activities, within the assessments that I'm implementing, and within even the lecture. So I'm going to close this so that I can drop these links into the chat. And the link should open up to a Google document. We're going to go just to that first link that I put, because what it should do is it should open up to this document right here. Black Liberatory K-12 Science Education Principle Mapping. Now, you can't write in the document, but you can download it for yourself. And as you see, I provided you links to the articles. I have all of the principles that are here and their explanations. And then here is where you would put in your thoughts about how you might be able to incorporate this idea of starting with the brilliance of Black students within a lesson that you would teach. If you need access to other STEMers, I provided you access to the R rights and go to this website, you will see that they've broken down across science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and STEM, Black folks across history who have contributed to certain things. And so you can identify folks kind of based off of what you might be interested in and actually bringing into that space. And then I've also included a site that produced a list of over 1,000 inspiring Black scientists of the day. And so as you're thinking about contemporary stories that you might want to incorporate based off of the topic that you're exploring, you can look at this list. And then lastly, from the work that I was sharing with you all that I was doing through the RET network, here's more resources that you can access if you want to think about how you can begin to re-envision curriculums, syllabi, stories of evolutionary scientists, people who contributed to different functions of STEM, cell signaling, pedagogies in science, syllabi, again, guide, mentoring, thinking about shifting from strength deficits to strengths-based mindsets. So all of these links are links to help you as you work through how you might account for each of these components in the lesson. And I know we won't have time, but I would encourage you to consider then the second link, which gets into this backwards design model, something that we use in teacher education to really help our teachers think about how do they connect the activities that they're doing in the classroom to the learning that they actually want their students to have. And so backwards design says, instead of starting with the activity, start with your learning goals and your objectives. And then from your learning goals and objectives, think about how you can operationalize those Black Sea principles. What understandings do you want people to take away from the content? What essential questions should they be able to answer from the lesson that you're teaching? What forms of knowledge and skills should they actually acquire through the lesson that you're doing? And then coming out of your learning goals, how do you evaluate that? So you've established your goals, then you think about how you evaluate whether or not they're learning or developing that learning. And then you think intentionally about the activities. And so that backwards design model flips the script to ensure that what you're teaching and what you are assessing is actually connected to what you want them to learn out of this space. So I will stop talking here. We can either do it off screen and come back maybe for like the last 5 minutes or so to reflect. I will stay here if you want to ask certain questions as you're working through the mapping of the Black Sea model. But I am encouraging everyone to focus on that mapping activity for right now. Any thoughts, any revelations, questions, comments? Yes, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I guess on section 5, there's a comment about thinking about the power dynamics of peer groups and making plans to account for them. And I guess, I've never really thought about the inherent power dynamics within peer groups. And I guess, how would you recommend we account for those when either in group activities?
No, that's a really great question. So one of the things that colleagues of mine at the University of Missouri were doing is that they were trying to make sure that when peers were coming together to form groups, that you did not have one person of one particular identity in a group by themselves. So they would have it to where it wasn't one group of one woman with all males, or one Black person with all white folks, or one Asian person with all white folks, but finding ways to make sure that at least two of said identity were represented in the peer group so that there could be balance and it could account for some of the power that might show up when it comes to peer-to-peer interactions. Another way and I've actually used this myself, is that within peer groups, you assign certain responsibilities. So somebody could be the leader, somebody could be assigned as the note taker, somebody could be assigned as the fact checker, and somebody could be assigned the responsibility of the reporter. So, like when the group has to present out loud. And then somebody could be assigned the responsibility of the curmudgeon, the person who's supposed to challenge the group to think a little bit more deeply. And those assignments are always randomized so that you're not always having the same person be the leader. And they found, and I found that as well, that it also helps to reduce some of the gendered based biases where you may find a lot of women taking on the roles of like the note taker as opposed to taking on the roles of the leader. So those are two strategies that I've seen people use in thinking about the power dynamics that shows up in groups as a way to help mitigate any forms of trauma or oppression that could happen outside of our control. Now, granted, we can't control other students, but we can be intentional in how we put in certain structures to try to help reduce or mitigate any particular peer-to-peer interactions that could be negative. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Other thoughts, other comments, reflections to mapping the principles? Have you all been able to get ideas down for all 7? Or do you need some more time to think about how you can incorporate all 7 within your own pedagogy? Because what we can do at this point, if it helps, we can break into small groups and you all could kind of discuss what you've done so far. And maybe there could be some inspiration that's provided to help you all finish. Or we can start to look at that backwards design template. Part of me wants to do the small groups because trying to introduce another resource with limited time, I think might be a little too stressful. But I do want to try to keep things open to see how you all are feeling as a group. And maybe in your small groups, you just share what you put and you all can compare strategies because you might have thought of something novel that may be inspirational for one of your colleagues. And you said we're coming back at 25. So if we do like maybe 10 minutes of small groups, or do you think that's going to be too much time? 10 minutes? All right, 10 minutes, small groups. Let's talk about what we saw and what we've been thinking in our mapping activities.
And Melissa will be working on those breakout rooms. So as soon as they're open, hop on in.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully you all had some exciting conversations among yourselves and found some inspiration from your peers as to some of the ideas that they shared. And who knows, maybe you all had similar ideas. And so there's some confirmation that you all are in the right train of thought collectively as you're moving forward. Before I turn it back over to the organizers, I did just kind of want to end with some reflection questions. You're welcome to sort of respond out loud. You're welcome to put this in the chat. But the purpose of these questions are to continue, well, how do I say this? Recognizing that, some of you may be very new to these ideas. And so as a novice learner, us as pedagogues and studying of education, this information can help in our own scaffolding of you as you're developing a deeper, more nuanced understanding. So from this experience, what did you find exciting? What did you find challenging? What strategies, what resources, what tools can be helpful as you're continuing to think about this sort of Black liberatory frame, or if you want to, a more social justice approach, or recognizing that you have had 8 modules now, more broadly, how you're thinking about pedagogy within science or STEM teaching at the university space. I won't call on people this time. I'll let you self-select. But yes, just curious. What did you find exciting? What did you find challenging?
Well, I could go, I guess. I really liked I hadn't really thought about the way in which knowledge was really altered, and where we get knowledge from and who is thought to be the expert or the knowledgeable. And it was a Western science because of slavery and because of lots of colonization, the disenfranchising of the knowledge from lots of places because of that sort of dominance of some people over others that happens a lot of places in the world. And I just hadn't really thought about what that did to the appreciation of knowledge from other locations, kinds of things. And so, and I learned this when I was in Hawaii too. Same thing went on there, and the loss of the knowledge, and they conserved some of it, and it's sort of coming back, which is sort of, we were talking in our small group about, how Western science has gone very reductionist, and some of these other ways of knowing, you might call them, are a little more historical, and they were more integrative kinds of things. And so thinking about why did that happen? Why did we go down that route? Thank you for that. I really hadn't thought of that history and what that did to our, where do we think good knowledge comes from, and that. So, yeah.
And I appreciate you pointing that out. I'll just give a really quick response. One of the things that I encourage all of us to think about is, because there are so many different ways of knowing, we don't necessarily have to say that one way is better and one way is worse. We can be intentional to think around all of these ways of knowing because they offer unique things to understanding the world and innovating within the world. So yeah, I appreciate you recognizing that there are these different ways that people know. Some are more reductionist, some are more holistic and integrationist, where there's a relationship between the person and the natural world. And I think that there's a beauty in seeing the beauty in all of these different ways of knowing without trying to say, this is the right way and this is the wrong way. Anyone else? A reflection? I appreciate you all. Thank you for hanging out with me on this lovely Friday. I hope that it was some good information that you all can continue to use as your journey to become deep conceptual liberatory pedagogues continue. And I look forward to remaining in community with you all in the future. Thank you all for the invitation to join your community.
If you all will join me in thanking Dr. Morton for a fantastic presentation that I'm sure we will all continue to digest over the next few weeks. Thank you for giving us so much to think about when it comes to how we transform our pedagogy towards liberation. We do have a few kind of closing announcements because this is our final meeting together. I want to make sure that you have all of the information that you need to finish your final action project. So we are asking that you complete your syllabus audit and submit it within Module 8 in Canvas by August 8th. You can also find our final reflection questions for Module 8 that we're asking you to complete within about a week. Between now and when we officially wrap up, you will be getting a link to a post-assessment survey. That link will be a Qualtrics link. You should expect to receive it around August 11th, and then we're asking that you complete that as soon as possible. As always, Blanca and I are here for office hours. If, as you're working on your final action project, you have questions, comments, concerns, things come up, please feel free to reach out to us. We will make ourselves available to answer questions via email, can jump on a Zoom, whatever it might be. In addition to that, we just want to thank you for your engagement over the summer. As a summer cohort, we recognize that this is a lot of information coming at you in a very short amount of time, and you've been wonderful to work with. Congratulations on the learning and the growth, and I'm excited for how it's going to translate into increased engagement from your students that you work with. So thank you all.
I just want to chime in and say thank you for joining us this summer. And I hope that, this is a start maybe or a continuation of your journey. And I also want to thank Dr. Aisha Jackson for joining me on this journey, and our wonderful GA Melissa for all of her support this summer for this fellowship experience. So thank you all, and congratulations on almost being done. Not quite yet. And we'll stick around if there are any questions as we conclude today.